Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The fifth and final section of the third part of Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity is titled simply Ambiguity, and in it she wants to clarify some important points about that idea, particularly in relation to another term that you see a lot coming up in existentialism, the absurd or absurdity. And so she begins this by saying the notion of ambiguity must not be confused with that of absurdity. These are two important but distinct notions. So how are they different from each other? As opposed to some other existentialists who will stake out their claim on the absurd, she's going to say, look, if you're going to make the claim that existence is actually absurd, what are you doing? You are denying that existence can ever be given any sort of meaning. And she's going to contrast to this the assertion that existence is ambiguous. So to say that it's ambiguous means something different. She says it asserts that existence's meaning is never fixed, which doesn't mean that it can't be fixed for a time, for a person, for a group, for an entire era, perhaps, but that it's never completely fixed. So two really different commitments that are being made here. She also says that if it isn't fixed, it has to be constantly one. And this is, a notion that's been running throughout the entire work before that. So she is going to say that absurdity challenges every ethics. If you really do believe that existence is absurd, you can't actually have an ethics. Now, we might want to think about Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, where he talks an awful lot about the absurd and actually distinguishes different attitudes towards it and does develop something like an ethics out of it. Maybe that's not exactly what she has in mind. But if you do buy into at least one conception of the absurd, life just doesn't have any meaning at all, well, ethics kind of goes out the window just as much, she says, as the finished rationalization of the real. There she's talking about Hegel, but it could be any other system that thinks that it's got it all systematically figured out. Would leave no room for ethics either. Why do we have ethics? She says that the human condition is ambiguous, and because of that, we seek through failure and outrageousness to save our existence. And she says, thus to say that action has to be lived in its truth, in the consciousness of the antinomies which it involves, does not mean that you have to renounce it. And she's, spelled out what these antinomies are earlier in the work. She's going to return to some of these again in this section as well. So the fact that we can't have some sort of absolute solution to the problem of existence, it doesn't put everything up for grabs or nullify everything if we understand life as ambiguous. Right? Meaning that we have to keep working at that meaning. And so, she uses the example of war and victory. She says that Pierre Few rightly says in war, there's no victory which can not be regarded as unsuccessful. Why? Because here we have an absolute. The objective which one aims at is the total annihilation of his enemy, and this result is never obtained. Does that mean that there's no success or loss in it? She says there are wars which are won and wars that are lost. And so it is with any activity. Failure and success are two aspects of reality which at the start are not perceptible. And she goes on to give you some interesting discussions that she's going to take up a little bit later. Art and criticism, right? Criticism is so easy and art is so difficult. Why? Because the art has been done and the critic is in a position to criticize it, to pass judgment on it, that is, right? Whether positive or negative. Criticism doesn't always mean tearing things down, right? So she says the painting is not given completely in Giotto or Titian or Cezanne. It's sought through the centuries and is never finished. A painting in which all pictorial problems are resolved is really inconceivable. Painting itself as an art form is this movement towards its own reality, right? It's being done over and over and over again. And she's going to talk about art. She's going to talk about science. A little bit later, she is going to say these are really as forms of human transcendence coping with the same problem, right? Why? She says that human existence through transcendence has to, as she says, found itself. Now, you might say, well, it finds itself? No, found itself. That is to ground itself, to reappropriate itself, not to entirely fulfill itself, although it aims, at least at the time, at doing something that is fulfilling, right? And she says neither science nor art is going to leave it up to the future to justify its present existence, right? And so this is an important point that we'll return to. But before that, just a little bit earlier, she's going to say that art and science do not establish themselves despite failure, but through it, right? So failure is not the end of the story. It is integral to the very activities of art and science or human action more generally. Both art and science can be understood as domains of human action, but it could be cooking a meal or saving a life or taking a life, right? Different forms of human action. So she's going to go on and say failure, always ineluctable, is in certain cases spared and in other cases not, right? So failure is an integral part. And then she's going to, coming back to this, she says, we're not likening action to a work of art or a scientific theory, but in any case, human transcendence has to cope with the same problem. Neither art nor science leaves it up to the future to justify its present existence. In no age does art consider itself as something which is paving the way for art in some distant future. So-called archaic art prepares for classicism only in the eyes of archaeologists, right? The sculptor who fashioned the Chori of Athens, ancient sculptures, rightfully thought he was producing a finished work of art, and in no age has science considered itself as partial and lacunary, that is, filled with gaps, right? Without believing itself to be definitive, it has, however, always wanted to be a total expression of the world. It never succeeds in that. The only places it does succeed are in sort of popularizations of science and the I effing love science crowd who think that science is actually like complete. And it's partly complete, but partly not. Same thing with art, same thing with all of our human actions. And so she says, we have an example of how the human being must assume their finiteness, limitedness, right? Not by treating their existence as transitory or relative, but by reflecting the infinite within their own existence, treating it as an absolute. This is something we do over and over and over again. So she's going to give partial examples. There's art only because at each moment art willed itself absolutely. And then she says, likewise, there's a liberation of humans only if in aiming at itself, freedom is achieved absolutely in the very act of aiming at itself. Each action must be considered as a finished form whose different moments, instead of fleeing towards the future to find their justification, reflect and confirm each other so that there's no longer a sharp separation between present and future, means and ends. So we have to take what we're doing as an absolute, even though it's not an absolute, right? We immediately discover that as soon as we're finished with it. But there is an absoluteness in what we choose in our ambiguity. Now, she's going to make a few other remarks in this section. She'll point out that it's easier to do this in a negative way, and she uses the recent experience of resistance against the Nazis and then, the aftermath as a prime example of this. She talks about, being against the Nazis, the resistance. It did not aspire to a positive effectiveness. It was a negation, a revolt, a martyrdom. And in this negative movement, freedom was positively and absolutely confirmed. And she says, in one sense, the negative attitude is easy. The rejected object is given unequivocally and unequivocally defines the revolt one opposes to it. So all French anti-fascists were united during the occupation by their common resistance to a single oppressor. What happens after the oppressor is gone? The return to the positive encounters many more obstacles. And we've seen in France where divisions and hatreds were revived at the same time as were the parties, right? So in the negative, the antinomy of action is removed. The positive restores the antinomy of action. That you have to make choices. That you have to prioritize some at the expense of others, right? And she says there's a real danger here. And she's going to give you some prime examples of falling back into what she calls the recourse to the serious, which she says is a lie. It entails the sacrifice of man to the thing of freedom, to the cause. And she says in order for the return to the positive to be genuine, it must involve negativity. It must not conceal the antinomies between means and end, present and future. They must be lived in a permanent tension. So in, again, ambiguity. Now, what are the examples that she gives? Goethe, Barres, Aragon, disdainful or rebellious in the romantic youth, shattered old conformisms and thereby proposed a real, though incomplete, liberation. That's positive, right? What happened later on? Goethe became a servant to the state. Barres of nationalism. Aragon of Stalinist conformism. We could think of so many other examples in our own time where we're like, well, they sold out, didn't they? She says, we know how the seriousness of the Catholic Church was substituted for the Christian spirit, which was a rejection of dead law, a subjective rapport of the individual with God through faith and charity. The Reformation was a revolt of subjectivity, but Protestant in turn changed it into an objective moralism in which the seriousness of works replaced the restlessness of faith. And then she brings up, we could call it broader than Marxism because she calls it revolutionary humanism. She's probably targeting the Marxists here. It accepts only rarely the tension of permanent liberation. It has created a church where salvation is bought by membership in a party as it is bought elsewhere by baptism and indulgences. So there's a danger of, because people can't handle the ambiguity of lapsing into the spirit of what she calls the serious in this case. And she's saying there is this constant tension, right? We want and we have to treat some things as absolutes, even though they're not absolutes in the full sense. And that's the way that we move past absurdity into an ambiguity that never goes away from the human condition.